In the March of 1996, Resident Evil hit store shelves across the globe and became Capcom's best-selling debut game to date. Along with raking in the big bucks for Capcom, Resident Evil also helped popularize the term survival horror, which would officially become the name of the genre that it ushered forth into the mainstream spotlight. However, Resident Evil is by no means the first horror game. In fact, one could very well make the argument that horror games have been around since the early 80s with games like Nostromo and Malcolm Evans' 3D Monster Maze, dating nearly 15 years prior to Resident Evil's explosive launch. One of the more notable horror games that preceded Capcom's zombified juggernaut was 1995's D, developed by Japanese company Warp and helmed by the sexy beast himself, Kenji Eno. For those of you not in the know, D is an FMV adventure game that takes place in a spooky castle in another dimension and shit. Like a lot of horror games at the time, the game mostly involved solving cryptic puzzles and inventory surfing for items to use on certain objects and the like. The game has often been compared to Myst, but I think the game shares a closer resemblance to another Japanese adventure game titled Gadget, Invention, Travel, and Adventure, which came out the same year as Myst. But despite the comparisons to those aforementioned games, D managed to weave an unsettling atmosphere that is still effective today, despite the game's graphical age. D would actually go on to be rather successful in its home country of Japan, and would allow Warp to work on their next title, 1996's Enemy Zero. Howdy guys, and welcome back to my humble little mini-series on the works of Kenji Eno and his game developing company, Warp Incorporated. Usually I'd wait till the end of the year to do a video on these guys, as has been the tradition on this channel for the past 2 years, but I've been just dying to do a video on Enemy Zero since I did my first review on D back in November of 2016. Enemy Zero has always been the most interesting of the Warp games that feature lore in it, at least to me that is. However, only until recently have I actually sat down and committed to the game and finally beaten it, and I want to get my thoughts out on the game while it's still fresh in my mind. So without further ado, let's take a look at Enemy Zero, one of the most unique horror games to ever come out. In the distant future, where traveling light years in space can be done with relative ease while still using Windows 98 and CRT monitors, the Aki is finally returning to Earth. But of course, there are some complications that put an end to the ship's smooth sailing. Somewhere within the ship, something terrible is stirring, and it isn't happy. The ship flickers back to life as it wakes the crew up from their cryogenic slumber, just as the beasts break out from the lower levels of the ship. You play as the recently awakened Laura Lewis, who now not only has to fight for her life, but uncover the mystery behind the arrival of these alien beasts along the way. Now, if you haven't guessed already, the game, like every other sci-fi horror game ever made, takes a lot of inspiration from 1979's classic Alien. And when I mean a lot of inspiration, I mean a lot. Just like how Deadly Premonition takes a lot of inspiration from Twin Peaks. But just like Deadly Premonition, Enemy Zero does have some original twists and certain elements of the plot to keep the story intriguing in spite of the game's obvious reliance on its unofficial source material. There were actually some twists and turns that took me off guard, especially a part later in the game that has this sort of dark and tragic twisteroonie that actually made me feel emotions. I know, disgusting, right? So yeah, the story, while not being the most original, is still interesting and fairly well told. The acting, though, is a bit of a mixed bag. Some of the actors do a great job at conveying emotions and acting like normal human beings, which back in the mid to late 90s wasn't really the norm.
Barry! Where's Barry?
Well, I'm sorry, but he's probably...
No.
Most notably, the actress who played Kimberly did a standout job.
Oh. Can't be true. I must still be dreaming. But it was such a wonderful dream, and now this. Laura, you knew about me and Barker, right? Why? How can this be? There's no way you'll ever understand. Your lover, David, is still alive.
But then you get people like David who just sound, off.
Hey. Oh, so you do remember me. I thought you were going to be so cold as to pretend to have forgotten about me again. You know that even back on Earth, you hardly ever called me. If it hadn't been for this situation, there probably wouldn't have been any hope of you and I getting together. Maybe for us.
Like, it's not awful, but the duality between talented voice work and, this
Ah, I'm alive.
is kind of jarring. Luckily, most of the time you'll be spending on the Aki, you'll mostly be just alone. Enemy Zero's gameplay is possibly its most interesting and unique feature. The game is split up into two different slices of gameplay, one being the exploration mode, while the other is the action mode. The former of the two is very much like Enemy Zero's predecessor, D. You're on rails in an FMV environment, which you surf for your inventory and solve puzzles. The puzzles in Enemy Zero, luckily, are far less annoying than the ones that were in D, which was one of my major complaints with that game. That's not to say that they're easy. In fact, if you stumped me for a while, but they never got to the point where it got hard enough where I had to look up, like, a guide or something like that. The other half of the game is the action portion, where you're given free range to explore the many halls of the Aki free from any rails, as well as partaking in the game's rather interesting combat. See, the aliens you're pitted against are completely invisible, and the only way you can tell that they're close by, aside from their screeches, is a motion tracker that pings more rapidly the closer you are to an enemy. Aside from the motion tracker though, the only thing you have to arm yourself with is a small electric firearm with very limited range and ammo capacity, so you have to be right up on the creature in order to kill it. Good news, though, is that you can kill the beast in a single shot. Bad news, though, is that they can do the same thing. To the uninformed, this might seem just like a minor setback. However, it's more than just that due to the game's saving system. At the start of the game, you're given an audio recorder that can be used to save your progress. However, you have a limited number of both saves and loads, so dying too many times means that you might actually have to restart the game. The stakes are really high, and no missteps go unpunished. Not only that, but you can only save in the exploration zones, and later on in the game, these areas get further and further apart from one another, which in turn makes the treks some of the most intense moments I've had in gaming. There is nothing in games to date that has made my blood run colder than killing an enemy just to realize it was only an inch from me. Now that, my friends, is how you do effective horror without having to resort to some basic old jump scares. I don't often talk about music in my videos, mostly because I don't think I have the general authority to do so. See, I took a keyboard class in my senior year of high school, and I sort of remember how to read music, but that's about it. However, I feel like music is one of the more important aspects of Enemy Zero. Written and composed by Michael Nyman, known for his work on the Academy Award-winning 1993 film The Piano, Enemy Zero's soundtrack is just gorgeous, and it has a quality to it that is rare for video games at the time. It's dynamic and always fits the game's tone perfectly, which is a pretty amazing feat seeing as Nyman never saw or touched the game during or after the game's development. The tracks range from slow and contemplative, romantic and acutely somber, to downright bombastic and triumphant. To simply put it, it's wonderful. The same can definitely be said about the often ambient and diegetic sound design. There are these low tones ringing out from the ship, the sound of steam hissing out of a pipe, and the sound of your footsteps echoing down a hall. It's all great, and for a game that pushes sound to the forefront, it should. The pinging on your motion detector is also rather varied as well. The pitch is higher of the enemies in front of you and lower if it's behind you. It's one of the more subtle ways of saying, hey man, you're about to get fucked. Now, I might have just been singing this game's praises for however long, but I definitely don't think this game is perfect. Just like every other Kenji Eno game, it's a flawed masterpiece, but it's still definitely flawed. The level design definitely leaves a lot to be desired in the action segments. Most of the areas are just these long hallways that all look the same. Not only that, but the ship is built like a maze or a labyrinth of sorts, with hallways running in and out from one another. Without the help of a map, you could easily spend upwards to 10 to 20 minutes just running in circles. Luckily though, there are maps, but they can only be seen through these computer terminals, which are found in some of the rooms. This is kinda odd considering that there was a mini-map in the training mode. You know, if they just removed the enemy sensor on that map, then I don't think the redundant level design would have been that bad. Like, maybe you could enter a new area and you don't have a map, but as you trek along the corridors, the map fills itself out, kinda like Silent Hill 4 in that sense. But hey, that's just my idea. I think my biggest problem with the game, however, is just how sprawling and hard the final disc is. I mean, sure, I know it's the game's climax and all, but there's like this massive stretch of the game that's comprised nearly entirely of these massive labyrinths that are only differentiated from one another by their color scheme. Not only that, but there are a bunch of enemies lurking down here, and one fuck-up could mean you could lose upwards to 30 to 40 minutes of progress just because of how spaced out the save possible areas are from one another. The only saving grace is that you get a gun with infinite charge at that point. Sure, a lot of tension is built here, but being killed after making so much progress in a game where both saving and loading is finite is the most irksome thing ever. Word of warning, conserve as many save points as you can for this part of the game. Besides those things though, there really isn't much for me to complain about. The game does what it sets out to do really well for the most part. I would have wished for more post-game content besides a higher difficulty unlock, but it's not something really worth me getting my panties in a bunch about. As for some of the more miscellaneous notes that I couldn't really fit into any other section of this video, I'd like to point out that I am playing the PC version of this game, which runs surprisingly well on modern hardware. Unlike D, the PC version of Enemy Zero was built for Windows 95 and Windows 98 operating systems respectively, which makes compatibility with more modern hardware a lot easier. In fact, I didn't have to set up any patches or fixes. I just put in the disk, installed it onto my PC, and it ran just fine. Sure, there were a few moments in the game where it would take a few seconds to load in an FMV after pressing an input, or on a very rare occasion where a cutscene would stutter and the audio would be off sync by about 4 seconds, but those were not really a big deal and were pretty rare. Also, there were no crashes or anything to speak of, so yeah, it ran fairly well for an older PC game. A few other interesting notes about the PC version is that it actually has two new enemy types called the Bodiless and the Armless that weren't seen in the original Saturn version. However, since a majority of the enemies you fight are invisible, it kinda makes this point moot. Among other slight changes to the PC version, there's also a new compass that makes navigating the ship just a bit easier, but not that much. A different computer terminal screen, and a less punishing saving cost. But besides that, there really isn't much of a difference between the two versions, besides just a cosmetic and graphical boost. If you're interested in picking this game up for your Saturn, then I hope you have $100 that you're willing to be parted with, at least for a North American or PAL copy of this game. Like a lot of Saturn games, the North American copies are far more expensive than their Japanese counterparts, and with a game like Enemy Zero, it's crucial that you play the game at least your first time in English. Although that hasn't stopped me from getting my hands on a Japanese copy of this game for the Saturn, which should be arriving in the mail anytime soon. Luckily, there is an alternative out there, As mentioned before, I'm playing the PC version of the game, notably the one with the explosive logo, which means it's imported from Europe, I think, but it runs just fine for me as an American due to the amazing lack of region locking bullshit on PC. This version of the game is much cheaper than the Saturn version, usually only costing around $15 to $30 online. So if you're gonna pick up any copy of this game, I'd highly recommend that you pick this one up first. Unless you're some sort of estranged Rockefeller with a sexual kink for buying overpriced Saturn games, then by all means go ahead and get the Saturn version. In conclusion, Enemy Zero is a game that could have only really been made by Kenji Eno and Warp. It's strange, minimalist, and wholly different than anything that was out on the market at the time, and anything really out now. I've mentioned before in my previous video on the cancelled D2 prototype, Kenji Eno was the kind of man who made the games that he wanted to make, regardless of what people or the market at large really thought of them, and kept that mindset long after Warp closed its doors. In 2010, in an interview with Kotaku Japan, Kenji Eno discussed his thoughts on the then current state of gaming, specifically adventure games, and the steady rise of the mobile gaming market that was sweeping across the world. In the article, he stated,
I think adventure games are displaced compared to modern day games. And if that's the case, then I'd want to make something even more displaced. It's because people make half-baked games that users think, in this day and age, why do I have to sit in front of the TV for 2 hours? It's better to make something that'll make people think, I've got to take time this weekend to play this game. If you keep trying to make something quick and easy, you'll never beat the mobile market.
Only a few years later, on February 20th of 2013, Kenji Eno suffered a heart attack brought on by hypertension and died not long after, leaving behind a legacy of some of the most unique gaming experiences, like Enemy Zero, that won't be soon forgotten.